Okay, while everyone's grabbing their drinks, I think they can hear us, so we will commence. I'd like to kick off by saying a big thank you to Novotel for providing the venue. It's a great venue for us, and obviously that's been very helpful. Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
A huge thanks to Jessica for organising this. Where is Jessica? Hiding somewhere at the back. You've probably had numerous emails from Jessica over the last couple of weeks or months if you've been involved with us for longer, and reminding you about what we're doing and making sure that you actually got here today and how to get here. So thank you, Jessica. That's been great. We're going to do probably 30-40 minutes of conversation. We'll ask some questions. Really want you guys to participate in this. It is a fireside chat. We've got some fantastic panelists who will introduce themselves in a minute. So I'll start with a couple of questions to get things going, but I'm really hoping that you guys have questions. If you do have a question, this dapper gentleman here, Ian, has a microphone, and you can ask him to come over and you can hold the microphone and ask a question so everyone can hear you. So let's kick off. I'm Neil. Most of you probably know me, but if you don't, I work for a technology company called N Squared, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how people engage with people in spaces and how we can create technology to enhance the conversation and collaboration that people are having within those spaces. So let's roll down, and everyone wants to introduce themselves. Scott?
Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Scott Smith. I'm Digital Commerce Executive here at Novotel Sydney on Darling Harbour. And I'd just like to welcome you all here. Thank you for coming, and it's going to be a great night.
Hi everyone, I'm Sue Beveridge. I'm an education advocacy manager for a technology company, and I've spent most of my life passionate about education, and recently, I suppose, how does technology enhance learning and the learning environment?
Hello, my name is Daniel Stiff. I work at the GPT Group, which is a listed property trust, and I look after GPT's flexible workspaces.
We sound like the UN in terms of accents. Sound the bloody South African on the panel. And my name is Barry Mashofsky. I'm a strategy director in a digital agency, but I've worked in creative agencies and media agencies, and it's all one blurry mess. Right now, everyone does everything if there's revenue attached. And I've worked in Sydney, San Francisco, and New York as well. So thanks for having me.
Cool. Thanks. Hi, hello. Hi, I'm Angela Brown. My kind of background is mainly FMCG and retail side, and I set up my own business about 18 months ago. I consult now in marketing back to big business agencies and retailers. I focus on shopper marketing, so specifically the shopper at the point of purchase, so what influences their decision and who they are, and work and consult back to companies with that kind of knowledge. So nice to be here, and thanks for inviting me, Neil.
Thanks, Barry. So as you can tell, we have quite a range of different backgrounds, and hopefully that will stimulate some interesting conversation. So my first question to each of you is, what's wrong with what we have now? Why do we need to change the spaces that we're currently working in, living in, playing in, shopping in? What is the challenge that we're trying to solve? What needs to change? Scott?
Okay, well, from a hospitality perspective, especially in hotels, I find that when people arrive, they're usually a little bit confused as to where to go, and our job as hoteliers is to facilitate a customer's journey and to make it more, just a better experience overall. So, for example, making the spaces easier to navigate. We've just gone through multi-million-dollar refurb here, and you may have noticed that the space when you entered was quite open. Just last year, it was quite enclosed, and as soon as you entered, you would have noticed that reception was on your right. If you look to your left, you've got the lounge and then the bar. If you turned almost 360 degrees around, but that just enables people to kind of figure out exactly where they are and where they'd like to be. So if there's one thing that needs to change, I guess it would be to make spaces easier to navigate.
Well, in education, there's a huge challenge we're preparing students now for a knowledge economy, and mostly they sit in classrooms that were designed for a 16th century factory model. And so what do you do with that, those bricks and mortar? How do you make them inspiring places to learn? We still have a custodian responsibility for students. They actually have to be somewhere every day, but how do you create spaces for learning that match the kind of workspaces they're going to be, and how do you blend the physical with the digital? So and yet we also have a huge workforce that has to be migrated, if you like, from an analogue world into a digital world.
Okay. From an office space perspective, change is inevitable, and if you don't change, you won't be competitive. So GPT is an owner of office buildings, and you can get pretty outdated pretty quickly. So in order to be able to retain customers and attract new customers, you have to move with the demands for the users of the space, and oftentimes to wait for those trends to already be there within the market means that you're far too late to do that. So the big challenge then is, how do you adopt the right change, and how do you adopt it early enough so that competitively you get customers who want to come into your buildings as opposed to other buildings?
Change in what I do is actually really disruptive and uncomfortable for clients, the Optuses, the Qantases, etc., who have the deep pockets but who want to diversify their risk. And what's interesting from a data point of view, I look at spaces as in everything around us and how could I monetize that for my clients and the behavior. And in Australia, you've seen disruptive change from the Uberization of services, which actually are just addressing people's needs on a human level based on immediacy and real time and treating people like humans, versus established government bodies, the taxi body, the industry around food and services, and all of these monolithic hierarchical businesses in Australia which have been averse to change for so long, and they've used government legislation to protect themselves. So what I love about it is even disruptive change for advertising agency business models who will become obsolete. So going direct to clients who control the budgets and then creating the best digital and real life experiences that make people's lives even better. So change, in my sense, in terms of space, is being fueled by data and not only augmented reality, but artificial intelligence, which is connecting different dots. And when you connect dots that make people's lives better, that's fantastic. When you betray their trust, like Facebook's increasingly doing, that's where the lines get very blurred. So it's disruptive change, and everyone likes the word disruption, but that leads to restructuring and disruptive change in a negative sense, but hopefully the upside is a hell of a lot better. Because in Australia, I think we have to do a lot of work with government, society, and commerce to connect those three, and other countries do that a hell of a lot better. But to pre-market works.
Okay, hands up if you've brought up online. Yeah. Okay, so guess what? That's massively impacting the retail space. So the rise of obviously digital media is absolutely, and digital mobile is obviously impacting that space. I was looking at some stats the other day and I thought it was actually quite interesting, but 40% of people shop with their mobile phone while they're in store now. So whether they're checking prices or looking at other services or trying to find out more information about the product they're buying, they're actually using their mobile phone in store more, and that's an actual Australia statistic, which I thought was pretty phenomenal. But if you look at it globally as well, 60% of people take their phone to bed with them, which is interesting. 75% of people actually take their phone to the loo because they can't be seen to be without their mobile phone. So you always want to be connected and on it, right? So that massively impacts the retail environment because there's a huge switch between what's going on in the retail store versus what's actually being sold online. And retailers have got a challenge on their hands to address this and obviously, work to address what the role of the store is for the shopper in order to understand how they address this actual decline in their retail sales. And there's obviously some big trends out there. There's something called showrooming, which you guys may aware. Yep. So showrooming is when people go into a store and look for a product, and then they see what they like, and then they go online and they buy it, which happens quite a lot with trainers, which is obviously a huge driver. And there's also something called web rooming, which is where people actually go into online and have a look and do their research, and then go in the store and actually go and buy it. So what I'm saying is the physical store will still have a role. It's absolutely not dead, but there's obviously some great switches going on between buying, online and versus buying in store. And there's obviously a big kind of switch going on. So that's a huge challenge within the retail environment. And it's how you address that and embrace that as a retailer, which will ultimately set them apart from anywhere else and enable them to be kind of live to the next kind of, century, which is obviously a big challenge. Cool. Thank you.
So if anyone has questions, please start trying to attract Ian's attention. But in the meantime, my question for the panel is to follow on from that. Is we know that change is inevitable. We know that change is happening, and each of us has got different reasons for that change. How do you know that change has been successful? How do you measure the success of that change as you're going through the change, as you're trying out ideas? What are the measurable points? And maybe we'll start with Ange, because we'll come back the other way this time.
Okay, I think it's pretty simple. How do you measure the difference? Well, sales. So if your sales go up, then great. Then obviously that's had a huge impact. I think when you look at kind of physical stores versus online stores, they measure themselves versus their customer satisfaction as well. And Amazon, obviously the biggest online retailer in the world, have got the best satisfaction scores within the industry. So as a retailer, you're benchmarking yourself versus online, and it's not just about being online and actually having a product offering online. It's also being price competitive. So as consumers or shoppers ourselves, we are being more and more demanding of how prices should be the same between the online environment and the in-store environment. So there's some kind of huge kind of changes there. But obviously, from a success point of view, you'd measure it purely based on sales and customer satisfaction, and that's kind of something that will keep being addressed as and when we start to evolve with the whole process. But from obviously it's all about experiences within the retail environment. The more experiences you deliver, the higher satisfaction you get, and therefore the highest return that you'll get in your sales.
If we're being honest, though, I think change is all about risk and the degree of the unknown, because you can use data to reduce the risk based on predictability and how people behave, but at the core, people are irrational. So when you look at they are irrational behaviours, and we're spontaneous. And how do you plan for instant gratification type behaviour in a business model in that way? And what's interesting is that I think our country is actually incredibly safe in that we replicate innovation that other countries have done very well. Jumbo Juice in America, Boost Juice in Australia, Guilt in America, the Iconic in Australia. And the Iconic has succeeded by really delivering to the core need around 3-hour delivery of items, and they're printing money amongst the female demographic. So we're a fantastic country. No, it's true, we're a fantastic country of imitators, which is great because Australians don't mind, but there's a very little innovation coming out of Australia that then scales back and boomerangs back the other way. So I'd love to see change in that respect, because the models, if you look at different categories, disruption, Soul Cycle in America. If any of you do spin classes, models have tried to come here, but they haven't succeeded because paying $25 a bike is not a scalable business model, because people are trained to run outside. Well, we look like London today, but normally you can. And then a gym membership is just an accompaniment, or group fitness training. So the behaviours of how people live, we're set in our ways in terms of sustained behaviours, but there's a degree of irrationality where that's incredibly lucrative if it's actually fresh and new and different as well. So sorry if I sound like I'm having rants, but I want Australia to be amazing, but the ability to innovate and to take risks, there's such a linear way of, we're only 23 million people, and New Zealand punches far above its weight by actually not giving a shit about how many people they have, but rather thinking this is the right answer and we can innovate. Like the Air New Zealand the sky beds, the insights was that couples were flying together, and during the flight, one was lying on the floor holding the other's hand. So they thought, well, what if we just sell the row and then they can create a bunk bed and couples can fly together? That's an amazing business model which has changed the way couples fly together in an economy. So there's no reason why Australian businesses can't think more laterally like that and have more of a commercial appetite, and then export and merchandise our thinking, which can embrace change in other markets as well.
And why do you think that is? Do you think Australia is more conservative, or is it led by the government not endorsing innovation? Or
well, the government doesn't create the infrastructure here to enable certain businesses to shine. So I lived in New York, and Mayor Bloomberg said we're going to be the most startup-centric city in the world, and we're going to fuel funding into innovation, and we're going to literally turn this into the hotbed of innovation that Silicon Valley will look like an offshoot. And now all the hot startups have come out of New York, incredible funding for technology and innovation. But now Malcolm Turnbull, and thanks to Wyatt Roy, they are leading a trip to Israel in a week's time with politicians and startups to replicate the Israeli model, where the $400 million a year goes into funding to keep the Atalassians in Australia. Why should young, tenacious people have to leave Australia to make a go of it financially and then buy holiday homes and come back and visit? Or come back when they've cashed out and live wealthy lives? Like, why is Australia not a perfect place to run Bonner to Bronte at 6 in the morning and then still grow a successful business? So I think government, society and brands in the commercial space, they're triangulating it hopefully a lot more. Or I'll end up going back to America to realise my dreams instead of living here.
Yeah, I am.
I'm very interested in what examples the panellists would nominate for places to see particularly innovative approaches to space and mixing people and technology and so forth. But within retail, we've got hotels represented and particularly business workspaces. Are there any places in Sydney, for example, or maybe elsewhere in the world where you'd say, go and have a look at that? Those guys do something really amazing with space.
Yeah, I think the one that springs to mind for me straight away is Google. And you look at Google and you go, well, they're fundamentally they're all about innovation themselves. But secondly, they're in a space which is very highly competitive for staff. So they want to build workspaces which encourage people to come to work and not leave, which are very different to a lot of our other workspaces which encourage people to come in, not talk to anyone and then go at 5 o'clock. They're also very protective then of the type of spaces that they have. So I used to be the property manager for Workplace 6, just over in Piermont, where Google were in. I remember having a conversation where they talked about they were in the building that I managed. There was another building across the park. Could they put a flying fox in on level 6 to go across the way? And I went, I kind of scratched my head and went, that's never going to happen, but I love that you thought of doing that. And I said, where did that come from? So we just asked people what they'd like to see. One of the innovation things they did, and they did it because they had a vote at work, was when they got rid of the monorail. They've taken a carriage for that. They took off a section of their building. They got a crane, they put it up, they put it into the building, they put the glass back in again, and that monorail carriage is a meeting room within their space. So they're doing things because there's a war for talent. They want to get people in, and then they don't want people to leave. So they want people to get in there, love where they are. You feed them 3 times a day, and they stay there and they do great work, and they get fulfillment from that as well.
I've got one for you. So have any of you been to the Ace Hotel in New York? The Ace Hotel is this amazing metropolis of experiences. So the hotel, very funky and chic. There's a co-working space in the lobby. The lobby is essentially people with laptops who come and just heaving with ideas. And then Stumptown Coffee is right an offshoot. Then you've got this amazing collection of restaurants, but you can literally spend hours just navigating through that building. And it's about networking. You meet a gorgeous woman on a date, and then you go for a business meeting. And spaces like that people crave, because in a city that is a pinball game like Manhattan, to go into a place where you can go and then it's literally like mini countries within a building of experiences, people crave that. which is why everyone's so excited about Barangaroo. It's our version of the High Line, that there are these coffee shops. It's the best Toby's estate you can experience in Australia. And it's the best of everything. And people have an appetite. And there's something in the water in Melbourne, because Melbourne have that formula. If you go to Melbourne, you're like, this is a different country. They've got the combination of culture, ideas, and people, and the community. It's a fantastic combination of all those things. And it's good that Sydney's catching up. Like, we've got laneway festivals now, thanks to Melbourne. So if any of you can go to laneways, you know what I'm talking about.
I think if you go to UTS and have a look at their brand new architectural structure and their learning spaces that they're trying to model as best practice in the world. If you go to Wollongong University, has just created an early start project which is looking at building capacity for Indigenous kids and bringing community into creative spaces which are absolutely amazing, with pirate caves and creative spaces for children and family together as a learning culture. If you go to a school like MLC that worked with student voice to ask the students how do they want their learning spaces created, and the architects have built environments for the kids so that there's walls that they can just write the whole all over the wall, or the walls created with paper reels that just come down, or there's a room that's just that you can just, it's all black and you can just lie on bean bags in. There's creativity in learning spaces in this country that will blow you away if you really want to find out who's thinking beyond the square to engage kids. And Neil's question about how do you know you're making a difference, and I think that's when students come into those spaces and don't even know they're learning. They're so engaged, their technology merges with the technology of that environment. They can work together. If you go to Macquarie University's student learning environments, the students are just there automatically using whatever device they've got, sharing it up on a screen, collaborating together across the country. And yes, there are some in Melbourne. There are amazing spaces that we are really trying to push into understanding how people collaborate and learn together.
Can I say something on that? I'm at the university. Thank you. Which one is it on? Okay, I'm at the university, and one of the staff who lectures on the program I run is from Google. And a few weeks ago, he invited me to come and have a look at the Google premises. And what contrasted immediately was Google have created spaces, creative spaces for their staff. If you look at UTS and universities like that, they've created spaces for their students, creative spaces. But if you come up and have a look at where the staff sit, they're sitting in little cubicles all over the place. There's a massive contradiction there, because the staff create the learning experiences for the students, and the staff are being completely neglected. And it's one of the issues I find is, if we look at stakeholders within organizations, the most abused and neglected stakeholders are usually the staff of the organization. So it's something we need to think a lot more about, is how we manage the spaces in which staff are expected to create and come up with something different.
Absolutely agree with that, and that was my point about we have to build the capacity of people who are working in those organisations who are often to migrate into a digital world, and sometimes they're a little resistant to do that because their practices have been successful, and how you measure change, the success of that change is really hard for them. And there was a paper released today about examining the effect of learning in a university in Melbourne, and what the students felt about blended learning and flexible learning, and they actually really love traditional lecture theatre style learning. So, you know, that can be a way to rationalise it. Let's not change, because the students actually prefer to stay in a lecture theatre style like this and not invest in that change. But as we know, if you want to be successful in the disruptive world, in the Google world, you've actually got to prepare kids for being able to work in those spaces. But I agree with you, we need to take staff with us.
How's your cubicle, Scott?
It's lovely. Yep. No, it's quite an open plan space. So we do have a lot of collaboration face to face. Yeah, it's really good. But just jumping back to the question from the back of the audience about cool spaces and hotels in particular, hands up who's been to Japan? Yeah, cool, a few of you. Did you know that you could sleep in pods when you go to a hotel? Yeah. So I just wanted to point that out there, that's a different way of using space in a hotel environment. For people who aren't aware of what pod hotels are about, they came up as an idea for actually Japanese businessmen who may have been working late or entertaining clients, and it's a place where you can go check in. It's very simple. You usually just arrive in your suit, you get a locker, and then your bed is actually a pod. So it's like climbing. I went to one, didn't actually stay there, but I got to experience it firsthand. You climb up a ladder and you basically slide yourself into a hole in the wall, and it's perfect just for a few minutes or hours, I guess, of sleep. But it works really well for that culture. So I think in terms of success, it depends on where you are in the world and what is necessary for the culture that you're in. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like Angie to answer some of the world, because you've seen a bunch of stuff in Europe as well.
Yeah, actually, a really good example is from Westfield in San Francisco. Has anybody heard this case study? No. It's they call it the Westfield Lab, and basically the insight is that less people were going into Westfield stores, so they had to do something about it. And it's the same around the world. In some stores, there's a Westfield actually in London where they actually host concerts and events actually in the centre of a Westfield store to drive people in. And here I've noticed that we do a lot of like fashion events and stuff as well within Westfield. But this great example of in San Francisco was what they've done is they've taken off this whole area, which is quite a big square foot, and rather than have a retail space like a Gucci store or something there, what they've done is they've created a co-working space. So entrepreneurs that are actually around the San Francisco area or around the Silicon Valley can come in and showcase their innovations in like pods within this particular area, showcase them to other like-minded entrepreneurs, get market feedback from people who are actually the shopper or the consumer themselves for this product. So you get live feedback, and also they enable them to rent the space out to launch the product as well. So it's kind of this trifecta of a number of things going on there, but it's a fascinating case study because it's taken space away from retail and moved it into entrepreneurial, co-working, co-communicating space in order to help entrepreneurs launch their business. So it's a completely different way in which Westfield are going about tackling the problem as well, which I thought was a really fascinating case study.
You triggered one example. There's a very cool case study in London. A couple of guys who used to live in Brooklyn moved to London, and they were missing Brooklyn culture. So then they decided, well, why wouldn't you get a big crate and then pile in all artifacts from Brooklyn, from designers, from grocers, and essentially they said, let's export London culture to Brooklyn for a weekend and vice versa. And it's interesting because we live in these countries where we crave to travel to others. Why wouldn't you export Tokyo to Sydney for a weekend and send a shipment of all of our best to Tokyo? So that, to me, is amazing innovation because it feeds a cultural appetite to learn more and to experience. I think that's awesome.
It's interesting that you're talking about these innovative companies like Google, but I work as a communications coach with mainly the corporate sphere. And what percentage would you say of people are working still in corporate spheres? There's probably 80%, would you say? Those people are being forced into areas that, for example, you said that students prefer to be in a lecture theatre scenario. And there was an article written by a millennial who said, I don't care about the billiard table and the dartboard and this space that you've put for me. I want real leadership. I want someone who's going to reward me for what I'm doing, who looks at me, who, if I work back till 9 o'clock and give you all of my ideas, and I want you to reward me as a person, this space is not, it doesn't matter.
So what's your question, Arabella?
My question is, how do we change people's mentality? We can change their space, but how do we change the leaders to embrace the space and also encourage the people to be their best within that space?
I'll start answering that, and then hopefully someone will pick it up. But I think it's all encompassing. The environment and the leadership and the management and the team. It's the people there as well. It's not one thing or another thing. It's not the space or the leaders or the team or the culture. You've got to pull it all together. So, I mean, Google is a good example. It has a culture, it has a team, it has a very interesting and defined leadership that is different from a lot of other organizations, although similar to a lot of other tech companies in many regards, which isn't surprising because a lot of people that work at Google used to work at Microsoft or at Apple or at Facebook or whatever. You know, there's that constant takeover.
To your mouth.
Is it not close enough? You can't hear me? Okay. So I think Arabella, to answer your question from my perspective, it's everything. You have to you can't just do one thing. Creating the environment is part of it. It's a step towards, and often you find that if you create a certain type of environment, it encourages a certain type of culture as well. And so, and the other way around too, a certain type of culture will create that environment, such as a zip line going between buildings.
You can't fake innovation, so you can't just build something and go, how cool is this? You can write on the wall, and we've got green and blue carpet, and no one has a desk, and this is great. Now our culture of our organisation has suddenly changed. It won't. So if you take the same group of people out of one habitat and put them in somewhere else, they might change a bit, but habits might not change. So in my mind, the change does have to be driven by the leaders. And you started off with an interesting number of kind of 80% of people are, in full-time employment with somebody else, with corporate. That number is changing. So it would have been a lot higher a few years ago. It's increasingly going down the way. There's studies out there to say that as early as 2025, that number will be 50-50. So it won't be a case of can organisations and corporates, will they change? They'll have to change because they have to appeal to people to come to work for them. So if someone gets up every day and they're a freelancer and they decide what jobs they work on, what companies they work with, it's then up to those corporates to appeal to those. You're going to want to attract them into your business. It's not just going to be about talk and lipstick on the pig. You're going to have more than lipstick and have something there that people actually are passionate about and that they want to come in to make a difference on.
I think you've only got to look at the Los Angeles Schools District's rollout $6 billion iPad program, which absolutely failed because they allowed 45 minutes of training for teachers in using them. And you can't impose change. You have to be aware, as Neil says, there is that point you made about the lecturers needing those spaces that reflect what the students are working in. You have to have digital leadership. You need to have champions within an organisation that are that change and have always innovation need to have product or a call to action so that there's a demonstration there's been an impact. And there's models all over the world that if you don't take people with you on that change, you won't affect that. There won't be the kind of effect you're looking for. And building the space and thinking isn't that, unless they understand what that space can do and what those impacts can be, that won't occur. So,
in New York, there were a couple of lawsuits against Goldman Sachs. There were young interns. One of them had a heart attack because he was working like 19, 20, 21 hours a day. And then Goldman Sachs revised their policy around, well, we encourage you to work as hard as you can to progress up the ladder, but they didn't really close the loop around timings. LinkedIn in New York had the same situation, and LinkedIn completely changed their whole HR policy. If any of you know someone who works at LinkedIn in Sydney, they have an office which is literally like a Willy Wonka of an office. You walk in, there's a full-time fitness instructor, there's a gym, the fully staffed kitchen. Now, obviously, these are things to stimulate productivity. It produces a tribal-like culture where you're all in it together. You work long hours because you don't have to leave the building because lunch is free. But that's really exciting and motivating, as you were saying, for people who want a different way. Instead of going and clocking into a 9-to-5 job, and a sense of belonging and purpose is what people are looking for. But what's interesting, like Google has their happiness index, the Google index, where they measure productivity and stimulation, and they fund your projects. That new way of working sounds fantastic, but the majority of Australian businesses are barely making payroll. So how do you stimulate a working class and the changing nature of work with wanting to work that way? How do you pay the bills? How do you pay full-time equivalent employees when clients are not paying your full-time retainers and it's project to project? It's a very uncertain, turbulent world. So it's fantastic to work like that. If you have deep pockets like the LinkedIn's, fantastic, but the majority of businesses are not LinkedIn.
So I'm doing some work for a moment with a client. It's a soft drink manufacturer, and they're great. They're obviously a very big business. What they've decided to do from an exec level down is actually embrace the fact that they want to bring more entrepreneurs into their business. So they've created this area on one of their floors where actually they encourage co-working space, and they have people who come from very different backgrounds to work in the same area, which is awesome. And then they throw projects their way as a business. So what they'll do is go, hey, we've got a problem with vending machines, and they'll throw it to these group of entrepreneurs, who a group between 6 and 10 of them, and they will come up and come back with some ideas of how a big corporate can actually address that challenge. Whilst that is great, it's not fully embraced as a total business. It's come obviously top down, but the issue is it's a great idea. They're paying a little bit of lip service to it, but the actual outputs of what they're doing is probably not socialised enough within the business. But I think it's baby steps in the right direction. I think they just need to, embrace it a little bit more and integrate it more within their thinking and their business.
We have a question.
Just coming back to the original question around how you change the culture to take advantage of the space. In my experience, I've always found that places I've worked where the organisation has embraced the actual customers, which in this case employees, in the design phase, and make them feel part of the design phase. In other words, keep the end user in mind, have been really successful, because if you contribute to the design, then typically you feel like your example around the flying fox, that came from a Google employee. So I guess my question is, if bearing that in mind, someone mentioned earlier on the huge drop-off in trend. Well, online is growing, online shopping is growing. So if we shift away from sort of employment spaces and talk a little bit about retail spaces, are there any good examples or good stories where retail companies have switched the focus around on what customers really want as an experience and transformed their retail space into something enticing? Because when I go into a Westfields, I always see an Apple store buzzing, and it's something to do with experience, even though I can buy an Apple product online. Are there any really good examples that we might not be aware of where consumer retail space has been transformed? Because I think going forwards, it's probably the only way you're going to be able to compete with online is something really funky and dynamic and different in a physical sense.
One very, very quick one. Sorry, only because it was hot potato and I got the mic. Jack Spade, Kate Spade's husband in New York, has created this store. It's a magnificent store. Actually, they both do very interesting things. His store was filled with things that he found interesting, and then he believed that there was an audience that would buy them. He bought photos on eBay of people's families from multiple generations back in America, people riding horseback, like the Abraham Lincoln type era. And there's a huge market for it because people are fascinated. People were had framed pictures of other people's distant relatives in their homes in New York. And then Kate Spade had this pop-up store, which wasn't very pop-up because it was this magnificent yellow branding of yes, and it was just about optimism in the face of a recession in America, in the meatpacking district. And her spirit of the range is very limited edition. And limited edition appeals to everyone. Messina is a roaring success because people know that their menu keeps changing. And that board is like the holy grail of fatness that people don't realize. It's awesome. So people are trained monkeys like me to go in and go, what's on the menu? And these crazy sexy names and oh, look at those flavors, and that's a primal moneymaker because people are walking in a habitual way. So it just shows you if you mix things up, if it's the same product at Kills that you can see in London or New York, why would you be excited to walk into Bondi Junction, Westfield to go to Kills? Because it's a commoditized game. If you treat it like a commoditized game, why would you have higher expectations? But brands that reach more, you can see the return on revenue because people are willing to spend more. That's my opinion.
Ange, do you have anything to... As the
So,
queen.
oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, obviously I mentioned the Westfield example, but there's another really good one as well, which is Jimmy Choo actually in London, where they are really kind of trying to embrace this whole digital space and physical space in the same environment. So they, obviously, the big thing is people go in, they see these amazing shoes, they realise they can't afford to buy them because they're about £3,000 a shoe. And so what they've got is they've got this hologram. So you can actually see what the shoe would look like on your foot. And then what you can do, because the big insight is that, as women, we want to have endorsement from our friends that these shoes look great and when they look awesome with that dress, all that kind of stuff. They have like social media connections. So you can link in with your Twitter, with your Facebook and your Instagram and share it with your friends and say, what do you think? Should I buy this? And it's a great way of merging both that digital and physical space in order to create a bit more of an experience, which is what we're all looking for. We're in a customer-centric kind of era of don't really care too much about the product. We care about the service, and we want to make sure we're getting bloody awesome services for the price we're paying when we go to retail stores, because otherwise you're just going to shop online and buy that product. So that's why the role of retail stores needs to change to deliver these great, fantastic experiences. Any other examples?
Okay, we're getting close to the end of the night, so we are going to wrap up. Ray has a question. Someone run over there with a mic.
So I just want to jump to the defence of Australia. After hearing us lambasted about how New York is the centre of the universe, some of the smartest people in the world are still here in Australia. One of the biggest IPOs you'll see in the next 12 months is actually an Australian company called Atlassian. I went to a Sydney startup group 2 nights ago where there are some really creative companies who are making real leaps and bounds in the US market. Now, our problem is we don't have the venture capital to keep them here, but Atlassian is still an Australian company. All of their R&D is still done down in Martin Place. So, there shouldn't be this cultural cringe that we're not smart. I'd spend half my life in the US. I still have to queue up in a supermarket and go through a manual checkout. That doesn't happen in Australia. So forget the cultural cringe.
Baristas in New York now.
We are smarter than anyone else in the world. We just need the government to recognise that we are still the smartest country in the world. We are still the fastest adopters of technology in the world. We still have the biggest network of FPOS in the world. We still have the biggest network of ATMs in the world. And we still adopt mobile phones faster.
That lifts everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Ray will be on our next panel.
Yeah.
Okay, one final question from Bob.
It's more of a statement than a question as well. I think we should think of space as the concept of space in a broader sense. About 30 years ago, I came across Seymour Saracen, who's an American academic who introduced the term of technicism to me. And technicism is the transformation of what is fundamentally a human problem into a technical problem. And I think this is the danger we face with the technical dimensions of space and the possibilities that this whole thing degenerates into a gimmick rather than something that is fundamental. So to pick up on your point earlier, to me, the relationship space is one that's ignored, is fundamentally ignored, and it's difficult, and probably it's ignored because it's too difficult. But that's a space that I would really like to see, whether it's relationships within workplaces or whether it's relationships with customers in shopping malls or whatever the process is. As you were intimating earlier, fundamentally it's about the relationship in the end that will determine the value proposition to people, whether they be staff or any other of the stakeholder groups. So that's a danger I see in this technical era in which we live, that we transform what is fundamentally a human problem into a technical problem and thus misunderstand the real issue.
And actually, thanks, Ken, because that leads us into my final question for everyone, which is, and take those ideas with you when we start thinking about how people engage with other people. What do we think we'll see in the spaces that you guys are looking at over the next 10 years?
So in the hotel world, I can see it happening today. Accor Hotels has actually rolled out a very large investment worldwide into technology within hotels, actually outside of our hotels, online as well, to improve the customer experience. But in terms of relationships and how people collaborate face-to-face in our hotel, for example, we've got 2 of the digitables from N Squared running in the Ternary, which is our new bar and restaurant. But basically, it puts a smile on my face every morning when I walk in, and I just have a glance every morning when I see kids sitting there with their parents, and the parents are having a great conversation with each other, and the kids are interacting on the digitables, playing tic-tac-toe or the ice fishing game, ice break or something, but it allows like the kids to have a good time together and then the adults to reconnect, which is something that everyone aspires to have when they're on a trip. So, yeah.
Well, I guess as we know, that kids are always way ahead of anybody in terms of technology anyway, and they know how to use it. And what we would expect, I think, in any learning space of the future is students who have the relationship point that you make. I mean, if education isn't about constructive relationships, using tools to collaborate not only within their immediate context but globally, working creatively, co-creating knowledge across the world, which is possible now. We have kids Skyping with one another everywhere, involved in projects which are amazing. But having those learning spaces that enable that rather than prohibit it because of the structures.
From a office space and a workspace perspective, I think there's probably 2 big changes or continuing trends that we'll see, and that's one is the blending of home life and work life and what that looks like. So when people think of workspace now, it's not just that space in the office. It can be, you can work in the cafe, you can work in your car, you can work from home. That will continue to change over the next while. There's been a lot of adopters of that, but I think there's still a large part of the market that either need to get culturally on board with it or need their technology to be on board to be able to let their staff roam free and then come back in when they want to, when they need to come back into work together as a group. The second bit is on flexibility, so flexibility for our spaces, and the traditional office environment and the leasing parameters around there is usually that you get someone into your space and you tie them in for 7 years, and you keep the aircon running, you keep the space clean, you keep the lifts going up and down, and then 7 years later you try and sign them up for another 7 years. Those days are gone, or if they're not gone, they're about to be gone pretty soon, because there's too much uncertainty out there in the market and in businesses on what type of space they need. And secondly, the shift towards freelancers and entrepreneurs and startup companies means that our buildings now need to adapt to cater for these. So the co-working spaces that initially popped up around the fringes of the city are coming into the CBD now. How do our buildings adapt to them? And as a plug for myself, I've got 2 co-working spaces and 2 more on the way. So that's a place that I look at and see there's massive growth in that. If we go from 80% of people in a corporate to suddenly 50% of them are no longer in a corporate, where are those 50% of people going to work? And that has a fundamental impact on the type of spaces and workspaces that are there on offer.
I've got 2 change examples, but firstly, just as a disclaimer, I love Australia. I think something got lost in translation, so we should definitely talk about this at a drink. I think for me, there's 2 things. Firstly, the first one is a marrying between profit and social purpose. And I know it sounds very altruistic and nice, and companies like Patagonia that have made their millions now say, recycle, don't buy more of our products. But I actually think it's going to become much more mainstream. And what I'm talking about are buildings behind us. When you have an enlightened government like we're moving towards, you have a building saying, great, you can put that building up, like one of your properties, but you want solar panels on your roof to provide Wi-Fi to the whole community that surrounds it. And suddenly what goes in becomes cyclical, and there's a give back aspect. And all brands, all businesses should do that, because unless you're regenerating society, it's not going to be sustainable. And the second part, and this is a little bit scary, but this is my industry, is that personalization from a digital data point of view, where it already knows past buying behavior in order to predict future, but it already understands you as a person. So when you walk into a space, even the act today of taking out a credit card, obviously that's becoming increasingly redundant, but the whole idea of transactions and subscription-based relationships with brands or companies, that's going to be acceleratedly irrelevant going forward, because it's going to be very much based on impulse and the moment and the offer that's best suited to you right now. And a very small example is healthcare. Medibank sold Fitbits to members a year ago. They gave them away. Cynically, it was a plan to reduce their premiums so that members wouldn't claim, because if they were healthier, then they would obviously not pay out as much. What will happen in the next 12 to 24 months is you're going to have a quantified model where if I run Barnati Bronte every morning like I do, Bupa should actually change my compensation from a health point of view because I'm actively working to be healthier. But that standardized box manufacturing line of product and innovation that we've inherited in the past, I think digital is going to lead a huge groundswell of change that's going to be disruption in a good way. So change in a good way, it's going to be personalization based on who you are, because spaces, technology and commerce understands that, and hopefully we create a better world from my industry's point of view than one that's even more cluttered than we have now. So yeah, profit and purpose, marrying that, and then data-fueled intelligence that actually delivers what you want and what you need, rather than helping you sift through that.
Cool. Thinking about Coles and Woolworths, I mean, how shocking is it to shop in those stores in the first place? I mean, any little changes are going to make a huge difference, right? So I think the big things are click and collect, which is on the massive rise here. So buying online and then picking up actually at the store, or indeed at a petrol station when you're on your way home. Because obviously one of the big barriers of buying online is that, you know, you've got to be in to wait for the delivery. So if you click, you click and collect. So you click, you buy online, and then you collect elsewhere, is absolutely going to be one massive trend here. And I know that Woolies have already partnered up with Caltex as well, so they're already kind of on the rise with that trend. So that's something that's going to continue, particularly as Amazon are coming to Australia, or so I keep hearing, but it is happening apparently. So that's obviously I can. And obviously the second big area all around the experience, which I've mentioned earlier. So at the moment, you go to a store, it's friggin' hard to shop the fixture, it's boring, it's just not exciting. So, you know, the big areas that we're, you know, within my industry, we're looking to improve is about making fixtures and in-store environments easier to shop so you can find what you want, making it more appealing for you to come to the store and purchase and have an experience whilst you're there. So an experience would be like a store within store. So like, for example, you've got sushi stations, or, you know, you might be able to go into a store and do your laundry, or do, you know, other things like you can do in actual stores within the US and the UK. So those store within store concepts are coming here to generate more excitement, more, you know, experience to when you go to a Coles and Woolies store, rather than you're just mission shopping when you get there. You want to get in and get out as quickly as possible because it's the most boring and the hardest experience possible. So that is the big changes that are coming. So watch this space.
Thanks, that's exciting. Yeah, no, that's really exciting. And I think, to wrap up, we've heard, although we've got a big range of, backgrounds here and people coming from different spaces and looking at their spaces in different ways, there's some common threads that are definitely coming through here. There's the thread of how people are engaging with each other in those spaces and how they're collaborating and talking to each other. There's the thread of how technology is changing those spaces and changing the way people do engage with each other in those spaces. And I think all of these things are adding up to some fairly fundamental changes that in probably 10, 15 years' time we'll look back at the spaces that we're working in now and think, wow, how did we ever do that? Or, as Ange points out, we look at Coles now and go, why do we ever do that? But and classrooms as well. I mean, we see, old-style classrooms changing into more open spaces and more collaborative-based learning. So this is all exciting stuff. I have been told that I have to tell you hashtag tomorrow's spaces, if you are a Twitter person, is the hashtag to use, hashtag tomorrow's spaces. I'd like to wrap up the evening by saying that we can all go to the bar by the Ternary, which Scott would love us to be, to have more conversations. I think we could probably have this conversation for another 3 or 4 hours. There seems to be a lot of ideas and people with probably more questions as well. Huge thanks to the panel for coming out on this beautiful evening and making their way here from all over Sydney. So thanks, guys. If we give them a big round of applause, please.
Thanks to all of you for stepping up.
Yeah, a huge thanks for coming out tonight, because it's not a beautiful night out there, as we can see. Hopefully you've gained something, hopefully you've learned something. Please, come and talk to us, and we'll, as I say, we'll mingle out into the bar area and keep the conversation going. So thank you very much. There's a button.
I don't know. Here we go.
I think,
Not sure if that